I'm very glad to have this great number of interest and the spread of the participants' provenance and origins. So that's one of the very few welcome side effects of this emergency state, and to carry out the seminar online and not in presence in beautiful Venice, as we used to do since September. So this series is going to run until the summer in an online mode. And this is a nice opportunity to reach out also to many other interested scholars, colleagues outside Venice and the region. One reason why this seminar has such a great interest is definitely because the topic is of high relevance for a lot of fields in the digital social sciences, the digital and the public humanities. So this or antisocial behavior on social networks and social media is a hot topic. Also under the circumstances of the coronavirus emergency, and maybe even more so, but this is something we have to find out afterwards. So the other reason is that we are very happy to welcome as our guest speaker today an expert of the topic, and that is Sara Tonelli from Fondazione Bruno Kessler in Trento. Before I give a short introduction to Sara, I would like to give some practical instructions. You are very welcome to participate in the discussion after the presentation, and please post your questions in a concise and clear manner, if possible, into the chat. So you can open the chat by clicking in the upper right corner. There's the speech bubble, and there's written chat, and you click on that and you just post your question there, and then I will pick up your question and read it, or if there is some need for clarifications or elaboration, I will ask you to activate your microphone and then elaborate on your question if necessary. And then please do disactivate your microphone again. Otherwise, we have some people working in the back who have the power to put you on mute. Otherwise, we have too much noise in the back. We are not clear in how far video is diminishing or bad on the quality. So I think if you disactivate also your camera, that is better for the transmission of this seminar. This seminar is being registered, so please be aware. So when you participate in the discussion by voice or in the chat, this will be registered and put online to our YouTube channel tomorrow or after a couple of days. So please be aware of this. We have a privacy notice also in the invitation email. Check this. Apart from this, all the materials, including the slides, are already or will be shared on our GitHub repository. This is all interlinked and referenced on our website. There you find also more information about upcoming seminars and other events we are organizing. I would like to thank my excellent team for the great work they are doing all the time, especially as regards the seminar series. That's Federico Boschetti, Tiziana Mancinelli, Paolo Monella, Linda Spinazze, who are organizing this seminar series, which is a real success in my regard so far and will continue to be so. If there are no practical questions, you can also put these kind of questions into the chat and someone will check, and we have also some communication channels in the back, so nobody gets lost. Otherwise, you just post it again into the chat and then we will get back to you. Now, I would like to introduce you to Sara Tonelli, who holds a PhD in language sciences from University Ca' Foscari, actually, in Venice, and a master's degree in computational linguistics from Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. She is the head of the Digital Humanities Research Group at Fondazione Bruno Kessler in Trento, and adjunct professor of language interfaces at the Department of Psychology and Cognitive Science at the University of Trento. She is currently involved in the CREEP and the Hate Meter project, both related to automated hate speech monitoring and classification. Sara is also part of the Epistolario project, creating a digital edition of correspondence of Alcide de Gasperi. And she's working on the national edition of Aldo Moro's writing in digital formats. In her talk today, Sara Tonelli will provide an overview of best practices and open issues in retrieving representative multilingual data from social networks to study hate speech. And she will discuss the results of her most recent research based on classroom simulations and monitoring messages from the Twitter sphere. The title of her presentation now is Building Tools and Datasets to Detect Online Hate Speech, Current Studies on Cyberbullying and Islamophobia. So thank you very much, Sara, for coming virtually to Venice. And so I'm looking very much forward to your presentation. And I like your first slide. So this is what I would never be able to do. The only thing I can imagine is participants are required to have some basic knowledge of Latin language, so that is not very exciting, but so I'm looking forward to your presentation, and afterwards we will have lots of space for discussion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Franz, and thank you to the amazing group who organized the seminar, and I am very happy that we managed to meet virtually anyway, despite the difficult situation. So today I'm going to give an overview of some work that we have done in the last 2 years about cyberbullying detection and the study on Islamophobia online, and in particular focusing on how to create data sets to study online hate speech, and what could be good practices when using this data to develop systems that detect automatically hate speech. I have to start with a disclaimer that in my presentation there will be some examples of hate speech, so apologies if this can offend the audience. Of course, it does not reflect my views. So what is hate speech? Definitions first. Well, in general, there is no strict definition. Intuitively, it's something that attacks a person or a group based on some attributes like race, religion, ethnicity, disability, and many others. In some countries, hate speech is also something that is punished and recognized by law. In my presentation, I will not stick to this restricted type of hate speech, but I will use it in more in general as a synonym of abusive language or offensive language. So you can see at the bottom of my slides, for example, 2 examples of hate speech. I think we all agree that these can be offensive for the people who are the target of these messages. So this is the kind of messages that I have been studying and that we will discuss today. Why studying hate speech? Recently, there have been really hundreds of papers and of people doing research on this topic. There are several reasons. There is the societal impact of this issue, because online hate speech can harm a lot, especially if young people are targeted, and this can lead to depression, even to suicide. So it can have very serious consequences, and that's why we think it's important to study it. But of course, there are also important stakeholders, for example, social media platforms, who now should try to limit the spread of hate messages on their platforms, also because governments and, for example, European Union are asking them to do it. And so there are also economic interests in understanding the phenomenon and develop tools that can automatically detect these kind of messages. At the moment, some social media platforms hire people who go through these messages that have been, for example, flagged by users and decide if indeed they need to be cancelled or that if the users should be suspended. At the moment, this cannot be done completely automatically, but there is an interest from social media platforms to try to automatize as much as possible this phenomenon. And as a linguist, also from a research point of view, this is very interesting because it's intertwined with how people communicate online. Hate speech is very creative, so you can find offenses that include neologisms. Language on social media is full of acronyms, citations, specific use of hashtags, emojis. So it's from a linguistic point of view, it's a very productive aspect of the language, unfortunately, and so that's why also it's interesting to study from a linguistic point of view. How data sets are built. So what people do when they want to study the phenomenon. So depending on which is the goal of the researcher, of the study, there are different ways in which we can create these kind of data sets. For example, if the goal is to have a broad overview of some topics connected to hate speech, for example, on Twitter, if I want to do a large scale analysis, I can maybe start by choosing some hashtags that are typically connected with offensive or hateful messages and monitor them. For example, in the Hate Meter project, we tried to monitor discourse on Islam, especially when this is offensive. So with the help of domain experts like NGOs and social scientists, we started by identifying a list of hashtags or keywords that could be associated with Islamophobic messages, for example, ban Islam for English or stop mosque for Italian. And then we started to monitor for more than 1 year Twitter using their public APIs to retrieve the tweets that contained such hashtags or keywords. This way to collect data allows in a relatively short time to have large amounts of messages, hundreds of thousands of tweets. And you can give, you can have an overview of the phenomenon. For example, this can be useful to identify trends or to do some really distant reading of the phenomenon. For example, when we then plotted what we found on to observe the trends over time, we could observe some interesting phenomena. For example, these on the x-axis, here you find the days between October 2019 and November 2020, and on the y-axis you have the number of tweets containing the hashtag #StopInvasione. And we colored with red the peaks when the use of these hashtag was above a certain average, so was getting anomalous. And we could find that there was a correlation or a correspondence between specific events or specific news or speeches given by some politicians in power at the time with the use of #StopInvasione. The most correlated events were for example, about the Sea-Watch boats, phenomena connected to migrants trying to arrive in Italy and being blocked on the ships And so all this discussion led to an increase of the use of Stop Invasione. So we can assume that somehow external political events triggered peaks in the use of Islamophobic hashtags, and so somehow triggered Islamophobic discourse on Twitter. We did something similar also for French and for English. For example, for French, we monitored the hashtag Grand Replacement, which is in English great replacement. It's a conspiracy theory that states that non-white people, especially Arabs, there is a plan so that non-white people will replace white people in Europe through some strategies like massive migration or demographic growth, etc. And so we observed in this case in a shorter period that there were peaks in the use of Grand Remplacement. In these days there was a public debate in Canada because some major food companies introduced halal certification for their products, and these events triggered an increased use of this hashtag, and so criticism from against Muslims that were evident on Twitter, and that with this methodology were quite easy to spot. The same for English. One of the hashtags that were monitored was Londonistan. This is an example of this creative use of language, because with Londonistan you suggest that London is becoming like Pakistan, a Muslim city, and we observed peaks of the use of Londonistan related to 2 episodes of a man and a girl stabbed to death in London, and several users associated these 2 episodes with an increase of Muslim criminality, which was not proved, but it was the discourse that could be detected at the time on Twitter. So apparently this kind of study works quite well if the goal is, as I said, for example, to track trends, but there are some issues. For example, hashtags must be unambiguous, and they should be stable over time. So we should choose hashtags that do not change their meaning after some time. Of course, this cannot be really foreseen in advance. It was important for us, for that reason, to select the hashtags and the keywords with the help of experts. But nevertheless, we also had some issues. For example, since our partners observed that when there was some a terroristic attack, for example, in Brussels or in Paris, the use of terrorist was associated with Islamophobic messages, we included in our hashtags also the term terrorista for Italian. And then when we analyzed the data, we observed peaks and really a lot of mentions of terrorista as hashtags in Italian tweets, although we were surprised because there hadn't been any attack. So when we checked what it was, there were a lot of tweets being posted when Cesare Battisti was arrested in Bolivia and then brought to Italy. So actually our data set looked really big, but in the end we hadn't spotted tweets that were Islamophobic. So the topic shifted and the tweets were about something else. Or another thing that we could not foresee is that often replies or messages that try to counter these hate speech messages get a lot of attention. For example, the tweet that I report here was the one in our data set that got most retweets. And although it contains jihadista, which was one of the terms that we were monitoring, it is not Islamophobic. And on the contrary, it tries somehow to counter this kind of argumentation, this kind of this use of the language. So that's why if you want to do a more fine-grained analysis of what is inside these data sets, just monitoring and collecting data through hashtags or through keywords is not enough. So we need to go inside the data set and really go through the messages. And this is the way, especially people working with natural language processing have been working. So collecting these big data is just the first step, but then usually if we want to have a high quality data set distinguishing between hate messages and non-hate messages, then annotators have to go through the single tweets or the single posts and assign a label. There are several existing benchmarks along this line, and also shared tasks. I reported a website where there is an almost complete list of all the data sets concerning hate speech that have been collected and manually annotated so far. And also in Italy, there have been several initiatives. For example, this AMI dataset is a Twitter dataset that contains tweets annotated with misogynistic, as misogynistic or not. And this HASPED dataset contains both tweets and Facebook posts annotated as hateful or not. And these have been used to organize evaluation campaigns. So the data sets are released, and those who want to develop systems based on these data sets can use them, then can submit the runs of their system that are evaluated and ranked. And in this way, you foster the creation of different systems for hate speech detection, and you also can see which approaches work best. All use the same benchmarks. So as I said, if you wanted to create this kind of data sets, these benchmarks, usually the process has 3 steps. So we start from a larger pool of messages that we assume may contain hateful tweets or posts and non-hateful data. Then some annotation guidelines are defined where we explain clearly what is hateful and what is not hateful. And then there are some, and then the data are annotated. In this case, experts, linguists can annotate the data, or we can use crowdsourcing platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk to let crowd workers do the annotation. And usually multiple judgments are collected for each item, so for each message, so that in the end we can see if there is a consensus on the hateful content of a message or not, and discuss borderline cases and try to reach an agreement among the annotators. So this is probably the most widely used approach to create data sets for hate speech detection. But also in this case, there are some issues. And about these works are very recent. You can find in my references almost all works are dated 2019 or 2020. So last year, this paper, Vegan et al. Was published, where they pointed out that these data sets, which have been manually annotated and are used by hundreds of researchers, may have problems. They may have a topic bias. For example, if I wanted to collect a data set to study misogyny detection, and I wanted to I could, for example, retrieve tweets about women who comment football games. I expect to find there a lot of misogynistic messages, but what I retrieve in reality is the topic of football. So I will observe that most of the tweets speaking about football will be misogynistic. So my system will learn to recognize football tweets, not misogynistic ones. So we need, when we create this kind of data sets, to be careful and to include different topics, and so that systems can be built that can generalize across different domains. There are issues. We have to be careful also with annotators. because we all have different we can find offensive different types of messages. Our gender, our ethnicity, our story impacts how we are and how we judge things. And this has also an impact on the annotators of this kind of data sets. There was a study by Sapetal last year. They showed that, for example, in data sets developed in the US, annotators tend to associate more frequently tweets written in Afro-American English to high toxicity. So to associate a hateful label to messages that contain Afro-American slang, although they were not originally meant to be offensive. But the way in which annotators are selected also has an impact on how data are annotated. And then there is another issue when creating this kind of data sets, that is it's difficult to share this data for research purposes. In Europe now we have GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation. We are not allowed to share posts collected from social media where we can identify who the user who posted it. And for Twitter, even if you just release the content of the tweet, it's very easy then to retrieve also the user. So there are issues, and it's very difficult to circulate this kind of data, even if they are just for research purposes. So there are still some problems that need to be tackled when creating data sets. And another issue is related to language diversity. So this is from a paper that was posted on arXiv 2 days ago, actually. And they display the data sets, the language of the different data sets for hate speech detection that have been released so far. More than 20 are in English, and for the other languages, there are a few instances. Some languages don't even have one. This leads to an imbalance in the kind of systems that we develop, with the most performing quite well on English, but performing much worse on other languages. This is also an issue. Having all this in mind, we tried to plan our activity in the CRIP projects so that these issues could be minimized. So the CRIP project was started 2 years ago, in 2018, yeah, and it was funded by the European Union, and the goal was to monitor cyberbullying and to prevent cyberbullying. So in that case, our target were in the first year middle school students, so students from scuole media, age between 12, 13, 11, and the second year high school students. So with this audience, with this target, the problem of data privacy, for example, was even more important, because the targets are underage, and we needed consent. I mean, it's almost impossible to have data from teenagers and to collect them online on social network. So we had to think about something different. We wanted to understand how teenagers communicate, how cyberbullying takes place, or how they interact with each other through electronic means, but we couldn't find the data anywhere. And we wanted to have this data in Italian, because the use case was to study Italian schools. So what we invented was to create a WhatsApp corpus of cyberbullying interactions through simulations. Part of the project, part of the activities were about creating a living lab, so several initiatives involving different schools in Trentino. And at the beginning, we involved 4 classes from a middle school. To collect data, we thought that we could set up a role play. So we created groups of around 10 10 students in each class. We provided the students a sort of plot, then I will show you a couple of examples, and we assigned to the students a role. For example, one had to play the bully, and the other was the assistant of the bully, the other the assistant of the victim. And in middle school, the victim was a researcher. Whereas when we did the same experimentation in high school, then the victim was one of the students. We assigned the role with the help of teachers. And then we created a WhatsApp group, and we asked students to play this game for 2-3 days and to interact following this plot and sticking to the role that was assigned to them. These are some examples of plot that we provided at the beginning. We tried to address different problems that could be relevant in a scenario of a class. For example, the first example, the gender division of sport practices, and some other experiences also that could reflect something that was that had happened in a similar way to students in the same school. So what we collected after, in the WhatsApp group, there was also a teacher that was not allowed to say anything, but she or he had the possibility to block some students if the interaction was escalating, and to time out some students. But I must say it was almost never needed. So with the first experimentation, we collected in short time 10 chats, so 14,000 tokens more or less. And they were annotated with the roles, because we knew the roles of the different people involved in the chat. Then on top of that, 2 linguists annotated also the type of offense that had been expressed through these chats. So we wanted to label not only if the message was indeed offensive, but the type of the semantic category to be assigned to these different offenses. And these are the corpus statistics on this first small set of chats. So we could observe interesting things. So, for example, that students this age prefer general insults. So they are almost always profanities. So they are not too subtle in their way to offend other people. There were also other categories that were included in our annotation scheme but that were not used. For example, religious and racial offense were not used, although in the class there were students belonging to different religions, but this was not used as a label to offend. We had, of course, and we discussed about the issue of the plausibility of the exchange, because in a simulation you may expect that students do not express their real self. They do not use language as they would use it in everyday conversation, online conversations. But we went then through an assessment with the teachers and also with the students. So we asked the students from one class to comment on the chats from the other class, while the students said that the conversations were probably less offensive than in real life. Parents said the opposite. So they said that in these conversations, their children spoke in a way that was very vulgar and that did not correspond to the way in which they talk and exchange ideas every day. So this was probably the truth is in the middle. We repeated this approach in different classes and in the second year of the project, also in high schools. So in the end, we were able to replicate it several times. So now we have also a kind of protocol that has been released, and if someone wants to do this experience, to repeat this experience, it would be easy following this protocol to do all the different steps. I must say that a lot of work had to be put in a collective consent from all the levels of the administration involved in this kind of process. So we started from the province of Trento, because the schools were all in Trentino, to the schoolmaster, teachers, parents. At every level, a consent had to be signed, because the users involved were very young students. With this second round of experimentation, now we have more than 9,000 messages that can be released. We are working to anonymize them, because sometimes they use the names, the real names inside the messages, so we have to go through all of them. The largest part of the dataset has not been annotated with the offense type, only the first, the smaller data set. But this smaller part with the two-layered annotation is also released and is available at the link that you find here. We also started to compare the chats that we collected in middle school and in high school, and we observed some interesting phenomena. For example, as I mentioned before, in middle school, offenses are very direct, whereas in high school it seems that students already have a better command of the use of online language, and also of the use of WhatsApp. They are more subtle in their offenses. They use less profanities, but they can be very offensive in a more indirect way. So this is also an interesting aspect. We were happy because this is as far as we know, the first data set of this kind in Italian. So WhatsApp data in Italian to study cyberbullying were not available before. But another aspect that we wanted to investigate is instead also the use of images, because before each lab in the class, we discussed with the students and we asked them which social media they use, and 100% of the students said that they use Instagram. But so far, most data sets used by the natural language processing community include only the text. So if a post is composed by image plus text, we discard the image, because somehow the vision and the text research communities don't work that much together. So we decided that it would be interesting instead to try a second run of simulations with a different tool, trying to simulate how teenagers, students, use Instagram, and which kind of images they comment and which kind of text they use to offend through Instagram or Instagram-like networks. We involved in a second experimentation 95 high school students, and we implemented easy, very simple tool which we called Grinder. So this is a web application that you can use through your browser. You have to provide a set of images, and then the application selects randomly one image at a time and displays it to the user, who is then prompted this question. So if you saw this picture on Instagram, would you make fun of the user who posted it? If you say no, then you are displayed with another image. If you say yes, the application asks you why. So which aspect of the image would trigger this comment, and then users are asked also to add a comment. What would you write? In this way, we wanted to collect messages that could be potentially offensive, because if we asked, would you offend this person, they would almost always say no. But the question put like this in a more indirect way would allow us to collect some comments, among them to find also potentially offensive ones. So we experimented this with several classes, and the idea was to display the same images to different students, so to see if there was a consensus among which images trigger the most comments, and to analyze which aspects of the pictures trigger most comments. And so we extracted some statistics. So in the end, we collected almost 18,000 images that have been judged at least once, and only around 1,000 were commented at least once. And the first thing is that we observed that the same image was usually there was no consensus on what to comment and what not to comment. So it seems that it's not some characteristic that is inside the image that triggers a comment, but more something that the user wants to find funny or wants to make fun of. These are the statistics on the reason why would you make fun of this picture. So the most frequently chosen aspect is the pose of the person, and then there are a lot of other, because the students told us that they didn't have the possibility to choose multiple categories, and that's why they chose other so often. But it might be that in the future we will introduce also this possibility, because in this way we are losing a lot of information. We also wanted to further analyze if the kind of subject in the images who got a comment, at least, influenced the type of comment. So we manually tagged each image with at least one comment, with the type of subject being only female, only males, mixed, or nobody. And then we looked at the categories that were highlighted by students, and we observed something interesting. For example, that the females are most made fun of because of the clothing, but for example, males more often because of the facial expression. There are some characteristics that involve both, for example, the pose. And in general, as expected, images that contain humans are more likely to trigger a comment, also an offensive one, rather than images where there are no human subjects. We also compared the pictures that were flagged as no, so I would not make fun of the person posting this picture, with yes, and we compared the two distribution. We observed, for example, that female subjects are those that get most comments. There is a statistically significant difference between the two distributions, but also males. So in that case, we don't observe differences between males and female subjects. So both tend or both get comments. So these are two experiences that, so the one with the simulation to WhatsApp and the one with the simulation, with the platform to comment images. Two experiences that we try to set up to collect data about hate speech that would lead to data sets that enable the creation of systems for the automatic detection of hate speech. Current approaches are mostly supervised and use deep learning, meaning that they learn from annotated data sets like the one that we have seen. A system learns from this example to discriminate between hateful or non-hateful messages. Since state-of-the-art relies on deep learning approaches, they are data hungry, meaning that they perform particularly well on English or on languages for which there are many annotated data, and less well for languages that are resource poor. There are several challenges that I think are interesting also for those who develop not only data sets but also systems. To me, they are the major ones are multilinguality. They need to create robust systems, the problem of multimodality that we have seen, and the fact that the systems need to detect the hate speech in context. I will go in the last part of the presentation briefly through these challenges. So the first is the challenge of multilinguality. We have seen that systems perform well on English because there are a lot of annotated data for that, and for the languages with no annotated data, basically systems cannot do much. But something is improving in this direction. For example, at the last offensival shared task, so I mentioned before a task where different data sets are released so that people develop systems that use this data to classify hate speech messages. It was a multilingual task, so data sets in different languages have been released: English, Danish, Turkish, Arabic, and Greek. And while on English the best system reached 92 F1, which is I think almost human quality, because if you take into account that two annotators may disagree, probably they would not reach 1 F1, which is the best. Means all classification is always correct. The best system on Danish, which had the smallest data set, reached 81 F1. So there are 10 points difference, and I think that we can do a lot of work to decrease this gap between high resource and low resource languages. And actually there are some very interesting attempts that are being made by especially the machine learning community. Now there are these they are called multilingual transformer-based model. Basically, you build models of the language where you put together different languages, and you can put together training data in English, for which you have a lot of annotated examples and smaller data sets, and all together they are used by a system to learn a model that works on different languages. So to classify, for example, Danish tweets, you can also distill information from English tweets, and all this with just one system. So without developing a different system for each language, it's a way to put everything together. And although the performance at the moment is not so high, I think it's one of the most interesting research directions that can be explored in the future. Another challenge when using data to develop system is that of robustness. We have seen that there are a lot of hate speech data sets, most taken from Twitter, because Twitter has public APIs and it's quite easy to retrieve data. But what we see is that systems that have been trained using Twitter data then do not perform well on Facebook data. So we have an issue with robustness, and we need to understand why this does not work and what we can do so that systems can work well across different types of social networks. We made a small experiment last year, and we evaluated the same classification using data from WhatsApp, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and see if using all the data together as a training could improve then the classification on the different social networks. And we observed that Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp benefit from having more data, even if they come from other social networks, whereas for Twitter, the best performance is obtained if we only have tweets as a training data, meaning that probably the language and the way in which people communicate through Twitter is so specific, the use of emojis, the use of hashtags, that including other sources probably introduce noise and make the performance of my classification system decrease. So this is also an interesting direction. What is the best way to take advantage of data from different sources to increase the training data for my system. Another interesting direction to me is multimodality. I already mentioned that it's very important to work in this direction because especially teenagers, they use the social networks that are images or videos plus text and not text only social networks. So it's important to have systems and to develop them that can understand what the combination of an image and the text tell us and if they are offensive together. They're having some attempts, and there is a data set that combine these two modalities. We also did some experiments. At the moment, from what we have seen, our system works well if we only take the text and we discard the image. So adding information coming from the images decreases the performance of our classification system. We have to understand why, and to find an effective way to extract useful information from images and to find ways to combine them with the text. This is also, to me, an interesting research direction for the future. And the last one is the context. You have seen also a couple of examples of offensive text at the beginning of my presentation. Most data sets of hate speech contain this kind of messages. So single tweets that have been evaluated in isolation by annotators as being offensive or not. But this is not the way in which we communicate online. So mostly you don't look at one single message, but you look also at the previous context, and you judge the offensiveness of a message looking at what the discourse is about. It's very rare that you just read one message. And often the context allows us to put the offensiveness of a message in perspective. You understand, for example, from the interaction that the two users know each other and that they are joking, so that a message should not be taken as offensive. We also did some experimentation in classes, asking students to evaluate the degree of offensiveness of some messages, and it was always what they were asking for. I cannot judge this because I don't know what is the relationship between the users. If they are friends, then to me it's not offensive. This kind of context is something that the systems do not take into account at the moment, or very few try to do it. But as long as we don't have this kind of information, it will be very difficult to have accurate classification. So, and with context, I don't mean just the textual context, so what comes before a given message, so look at the thread and not just the single message, but also how the network of the different users is built. I mentioned here a work that we presented last year, especially in our project where we studied cyberbullying. Cyberbullying is by definition an offense that targets the same victim several times. So it's impossible to develop systems that detect cyberbullying phenomena if you don't take into account also the structure of the network and the times the kind of interaction between two users, and if the victim is always a victim. Maybe the two users offend each other often, and in this case, it's it's questionable if it's cyberbullying, because there must be some sort of imbalance in the relation between the two users to define this interaction as a cyberbullying. So all this information is something that to develop accurate hate speech detection system must be taken into account, and at the moment, in my view, are missing. This leads to the conclusion of my talk, where I introduced the problem of creating data sets and systems to analyze hate speech. As you have seen, it's a very difficult task, and it's difficult from the beginning. So from the definition of what is a hate speech to the manual annotation, and all these difficulties can be found also when from the manual annotation we try to pass to the automatic one. I didn't mention also some other aspects of messages that make it very challenging to identify offensive messages online. We can have different different way in which systems make mistakes in the prediction. For example, it's still very difficult for automatic systems to analyze dialect or slang. We don't have systems, or very few systems can deal with bad orthography. In social network, we often write ungrammatical post sentences. We make mistakes. We use non-canonical forms of Italian, and this is very difficult to process automatically. The use of sarcasm, you write something, and irony also, you write something, but you mean the opposite. Again, it's very, very difficult for systems to detect it. Sometimes in order to judge the offensiveness of a message, you need to have some word knowledge that helps you in the interpretation, and the system at the moment doesn't have it. And also metaphorical expressions or the use of creative language is still a challenge. It makes this task very interesting, and as I said, this makes hate speech very interesting to study also from a linguistic point of view, but very challenging if the final goal is to develop systems that detect this kind of speech automatically. So my plans is to continue focusing on different languages. There is still a lot of work on English and less on other languages, and especially on Italian. Then the promising research directions that I foresee are multimodality, and as I said, context, to take into account the threads and the network structure to build better data sets and also better hate speech detection systems. These are some references of works that I mentioned in my presentation. And with this, I conclude my seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sara. So this was a very impressive and highly interesting introduction overview about this field that is not common to every one of us. And I hope your experience as a presenter was okay. So you were not alone all the time. So you had 50 highly attentive listeners. So I can assure you that. And in parallel, Paolo Monella tweeted on Twitter all your contents, so you have a large audience actually. So thank you, Paolo, for following the presentation on Twitter. Paolo is actually in our chat, Apollo. So everyone who's wondering who this guy Apollo is, that's Paolo. Okay, so thank you very much. We have now room for discussion, and we used to do it like this. So if you have a question, please post it into the chat, which you can open when you click on the chat button or the bubble in the right upper corner. So try to be concise and clear. If you feel you are not able to put your question into a phrase, you can also just raise your hand by typing your name. So that's fine, and then we can give you space to actually speak your question. Okay, so that's it. If we miss a personal question, you can post it once again into the chat, and that works, I hope. So you have a lot of nice comments in the chat. I don't know if are you reading the chat as well, Sara? Or,
yes.
Yeah. So this is all recorded. You can read it afterwards. So the floor is open for questions.
Oh.
Here's a nice question from Monica. Did you plan to adapt your system to detect the impact of COVID-19 on our life? I think that's a bit early, but yeah.
Yeah, but maybe early. I don't know. Maybe to detect what is the opinion towards some aspects of our life that are affecting us. So hate speech systems can be built similarly to stance detection or opinion mining systems. So to understand if the opinion about the topic is positive or negative. And if I think about COVID, I think people are complaining online about a number of things. So if we had annotated data, then it would be not difficult to adapt it to the current situation. And as a first step, we could start with trend monitoring that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. So identifying some hashtags that are clearly associated with some negative opinion about the lockdown or other things that are happening these times, and look at the trends.
Okay, thank you. As long as there are no other questions. So I just said we have to do such research, maybe looking back, but maybe I'm wrong. Is it possible?
I've seen other questions popping up, but
yeah.
So sorry.
My question is, can we do this kind of research as a historian, so looking back at data that has been produced in the past, or is this data only so available or retrievable while it is being produced in such media? So I maybe I'm naive, so I was thinking shouldn't be a problem to do this kind of research also as a historian working on older tweets. Is this right? Or?
Well, for tweets, if you use the freely available APIs, I think you can go back just 10 days. But there is a possibility to pay a small fee to Twitter and to go back more in time. So in that case, it would be possible to retrieve older data.
More questions? Or you can also...
I have seen some popping up, but they were too quick. Yes.
So I'm scrolling up. Well, this was all kudos. Grazie.
Does the Twitter Open API allow researchers?
I can't find it right now.
Should I read it?
Please,
okay.
Yeah, if you have found a question, sorry, I missed that one. Here, so, I see. So it's Paolo. Paolo, do you want to read it yourself? I mean, you're part of the team and your quality is good.
My quality isn't good, but I'm talkative.
Your voice quality.
Yeah, it is. Okay, Sara, thank you very much. That was, as we suspected, very interesting. You mentioned that the context that we need is not only a linguistic context, so I reply to you, but also in what kind of relationship we are. Like we're joking because we're friends, or I'm actually offending you. So does the Open API of Twitter provide this kind of information to researchers? Can a researcher know what the social network of a person is? That's also a privacy hot topic, by the way.
Yes.
But that would be useful, I think.
It's, I mean, it's possible. If you use the Twitter API, you get all possible information on a message, so also who posted it, and so you get information on the users, and through this you can somehow reconstruct the network of the interactions. And then you can see, for example, for our project on Islamophobia, we could study the structure of the network and see which were the hubs that spread the most messages. We were surprised, for example, to see that these were not popular people. It was not, I don't know, the account from Salvini that spread most of the information about migrants, but some people around his network who really played like a major hub in the spread of this kind of messages. It's not something that is directly given by Twitter, but it can be reconstructed once you have all the tweets, you have all the replies or all the likes, and through this mechanism you can get information about the network. On the other hand, GDPR says that profiling is not allowed, so it's still a gray area what can be done with user information.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
There is another question by our visiting scholar Carolina Fernandez Castrillo from Madrid. Now I lost it. Oh,
is there any study on favorite social media depending on age? There are. I can try to find again the link and share with you. But it was also confirmed with the surveys that we made in the classes for our labs. So Facebook is the social network of middle-aged people. Well, this also depends on the country, but in general, younger users prefer video social networks using videos like TikTok. In a middle school, they almost everybody use Musical.ly, which was a platform that we didn't know at all. And then all teenagers have an Instagram account, but it's very interesting to see how they use it, because they use it to post things taken from other social networks. For example, they post as Instagram story a TikTok video. So that's why it's also very difficult to build tools that detect, for example, automatically cyberbullying, because the scenario of social media is changing very quickly. Every year there are new social media, and the students in that age, so that young, use different social networks, communicate by merging, exchanging channels, and in that they also have communication in person. So it's almost impossible to have the whole picture of a conversation if you don't control, I don't know, 5 social networks. Also they use gaming platforms. It's very, very complex scenario that is not limited to just one channel. That's why also we met parents concerned when we presented this project on cyberbullying. They asked us what they could do to control their children, and we told it's impossible to control. It's better to try to empower, because controlling is something that is not feasible, and if they want to hide something, they will always manage to hide something. So it's better to make them more, to give them more knowledge about the risks and to empower them.
Well, thank you so much, Sara. This is Carolina from Madrid.
Hi.
Hi. And well, now I have I'm feeling better finally. And I have now a subject at university that is for students from the first year, so they are very young, and it's on social relations on internet. And there is one topic that is on the hate speech, and I will really like to introduce your presentation. I think it's going to be the key part of this session. And I was wondering, in order to help them also to do their own research, for the tesi di laurea and all these final projects, which methods do you suggest? Because sometimes I am lost when they want to study a topic and to see the impact through the social networks. Apart from the hashtags, I am pretty sure you have much more information, and how can we support them in order, I don't know, to analyze some aspects in an easy way? I have seen your point that this way in the future that you're exploring to mix the images with the text, the video all together, that is going to be difficult, but it's going to be very, very important to this sort of studies. But maybe for a lower level of research for these students, how can they look for this?
It's difficult because I already spoke also to students who wanted to write their thesis, for example, on hate speech, and there is a first obstacle, that is the collection of data. So Twitter has APIs, and it is relatively easy to collect data, but if you don't have some technical expertise, it's nevertheless difficult. For other social networks, it's even more difficult. Instagram, for example, has no APIs, and there is no way to get their data in an official way unless you hack the profiles, which is forbidden, and we don't do. it's probably better to do some qualitative study or to start from data sets that already exist. As I said, students, they can look at the websites of these shared tasks where you have different data sets in different languages that have been annotated following the same annotation scheme. I mean, there are several that have been developed maybe for other purposes, so to train systems, but and that no one studied from the content point of view, that are nevertheless interesting. So if the students want to work on large amounts of data, maybe it's better to reuse what we already have. Often they were never studied by linguists or by people who do something different than developing systems.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We have a... Oh, sorry, Carolina?
No, just to say thank you.
Okay. So we have two further questions. Deborah Paci has a question, and while she's putting her microphone on voice, there's another question by Armin Höhnen. Are negation and irony or sarcasm bigger issues? You mentioned that briefly.
Yes. Although now there are, so the state of the art is there are ways to represent these messages as a single, so the representation that you get to feed your system take into account the whole sentence and not just the separate tokens. So now for example, negation is starting to be solved as a problem, because, as I said, now the representation we give take into account also the fact that one term is negated. Concerning irony and sarcasm, it's more difficult. But probably if you use social networks, you notice that even users don't get sarcasm and irony on social networks. And it is, I recommend not to use them because people don't get them. So for machines, this is still an open issue.
But you use emoticons? I mean, usually they are the indicator in what mode you are speaking.
Yeah, emoticons are an important part of the messages, and it's definitely very, very important to include them in the representation. We noticed, we were really surprised to see that some data sets created by computer scientists for developing systems did not include emoticons, because they said, yeah, we discard everything that is not alphanumeric. And I mean, if you don't include them, often emoticons reverse the tone or the sense of a tweet. So if you create data sets where they are deleted, it's a huge mistake. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Deborah.
Yes, of course. I was wondering if you are monitoring hate speech emoji use, emoticon or emoji use. You know, as images, emoji transmit ideas, emotions, and intents from one digital user to another. So emojis function not only as signifiers of emotion and clarifiers of intent in digital spaces, but also as mediators of self-expression on the cultural identity. So, yes.
Okay, then we have a question by Giorgia Minello. What about video? So she means how your system would work with TikTok, for instance.
No, at the moment we don't process video, but just because as a group we don't do research in video processing. But for sure it's very, very important to include videos in hate speech detection systems. We did some experiments with YouTube, trying to see if without processing the video, but just looking at the description, that is hidden behind the video, and at the comments you could somehow understand if the video was offensive or not. And yes, the comments and the description are rather a proxy of the content. So just looking at the comments, at the title and the description of the video, we could, for example, detect which channels, which videos were Islamophobic. But of course, in order to do something which works better, we would need also to process the video. As far as I know, there are no systems yet that are able to combine the different modalities, including the video.
There's a question from Stuart James that goes in the same direction, so about the difficulty of using vision and text. So this is a very common problem, and as a vision researcher, he and his team is working on this. However, he's saying, in quote, vision isn't trained on abstract labels. Instead, tasks like, for example, detect the cats. We have done some research in using higher level labels like peer relationships, parties, and personal. Noisy data breaks vision, less so for text. You may find sample selections very useful, like we did.
Yeah, it's something, it's very tricky because you have first to understand which is the relationship between the text and the image. Sometimes the two together have one meaning. Sometimes the text is just a comment or a replication of what you see in an image. Sometimes it's something that criticizes the content of the image. So the first step is to understand what is the relation between text and image. And then it's true that current system that analyze images detect the objects very well, but for hate speech detection it's not so useful. So for example, we worked on a data set where an image of a boy, and normal boy, with a t-shirt from Juventus triggered a lot of hateful comments. In that case, you would need a system that detects not only that in the picture you have a boy and a t-shirt, but also the problem was which kind of t-shirt it was. So it's a task that is completely different from object detection that now can be done very well by image processing systems. We also did some experiments on Instagram data to see if we could combine information distilled from images and from text to understand if a thread was offensive. And in the end, we got the best performance looking just at the text. So what we can get from images in our system did not help. But I mean, yeah, there is a lot of research that can be done in this direction. It might be that we picked the wrong information from the image. So yeah, I agree with the observation.
Yeah. Here's an interesting question from Carlo Romano Santa Giustina. How could one study the process through which one becomes a social media bully or a hate speaker? Are social media bullies recidivist? I don't know this word actually in English. Well, I have an idea. Yeah. And is the history on one's bullying acts helpful to predict the probability of bullying again?
Yeah, there are studies that show that users who use, for example, a violent language tend to use it across different domains and in different situations. So they are not just offensive once, but they tend to be angry users quite often. So for sure, looking at the user behavior across time or in different interactions would help identifying this kind of language. But as I said, we have problems with profiling people because it's forbidden. So officially, what we can do is very, very limited. You cannot profile by race, gender, political party, and so all the studies that try to connect extremist, right-wing movements with violence online. We don't know how far we can do with the profiling of the users.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Rita Maria Bucciarelli, but I think we answered that already about negative communications. If I'm wrong, please raise your voice, Rita Maria. Altrimenti, there's a question from Francesca Mangialardo. I was wondering if you found out that a certain social media is generally more used to offend than others.
Well, there are some social networks where the identity of the users is concealed, it's completely anonymous, that are very offensive. So there was a study on Ask FM, which was a social network widely used for a while by teenagers, where you could post stuff without logging in with the user. So you could be completely anonymous. And they observed that it contained a high amount of offensive communication. So I think that the more users can be concealed and can use false identities, the more they feel free to offend.
Okay, I have two questions. A large part of your research is based on these simulations, classroom simulations. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, and maybe I missed your assessment of this. If you simulate this situation, you're creating data that is reflecting more the opinion, our opinion, or the opinion of the participants about what you are actually interested in, rather than the actual facts or the real world facts that you want to analyze. So you're reproducing opinion instead of capturing data that you want to analyze. How do you deal with this, or is this just the basis to then do other research? Why? Because it helps to enhance your tools, for example. So that's one question. Mm-hmm. And the other question is, when you create all this data of offensive antisocial speech, so we as scholars, we always have to show and publish our data, so to make also the analysis reproducible. So that's a very important indicator for the quality of our work. In this case, you reproduce and publish offensive speak, and you disseminate what you are supposed to fight against. So how do you deal with this?
Yeah, I must say both comments are very true. I don't really have an answer. So in the first case, it's a limit of simulations. I mean, we asked the students to behave normally and to try to express the way they talk to each other through WhatsApp every day. Of course, we are not sure that this is exactly what they would say. As I said, we did a cross test. So we asked students to judge chats produced by other classes, and they said they are being too mild, they are being less offensive than in real life. And then when parents saw the chats, they said, my children would never speak like this. They are using profanities, hate speech, only because you ask them to. So this is too extreme. They would never talk like this. So we don't know. But the alternative was to have no data at all. Because in order to have a WhatsApp chat to be used for research purposes, you would need to have the consent of each user involved in a chat, meaning that if one says no, you can release the chat with some holes, some gaps. And you would never be able to reconstruct the conversation. So there were other experiences I've seen in Switzerland, where they asked people to donate their WhatsApp chats. In that case, they were adults, and in that way they could collect some data. But there aren't many alternatives if we want to look at WhatsApp. And for the release of the data, yeah, it's true again. If you want to study hate speech, I mean, yeah, we circulate material that we would prefer to hide.
But it's not a legal problem, for example. So you are allowed to. I mean, in Germany, for example, you can't publish Mein Kampf from Adolf Hitler, for example, except in a critical annotated thing. But I mean, not the raw data, let's say.
Yeah.
So,
well,
that makes sense.
No, I've seen that all over the world, groups annotate and release this data, and of course, you release your data always with the disclaimer that I mean the data can have offensive content, and also in the papers, in our scientific papers, we always put this disclaimer, and yeah, we cannot do much more.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? If this is not the case, I mean, we keep in contact, and we want you to come to Venice also in person as soon as possible. And I'm very sorry we can't invite you for an aperitivo on Campo Margarita adesso, but yeah, that's how it is right now. So I'm very glad and grateful that we shared this time together virtually, and I think everyone agrees. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks for the participants also for the questions.
Yeah. So as I said, we will publish all the materials and link to it from our website and further information. We will meet again next week. There will be a presentation by Mary Redmond, who is at the moment our visiting professor from Trinity College Dublin. And she is talking about creating interactive narratives in cultural contexts. And she will talk about her experience in designing exhibitions around the manuscripts of James Joyce and Samuel Beckett, so a very, very nice material, but also about digitizing and publishing the 19th century manuscript, the famous Book of Kells. And she will discuss the possibility also of using technology to regenerate or recreate Francis Bacon's studio from London, which already has been physically relocated to Dublin in his native city, and so she will talk about that as well. We look very much forward to the next seminars and to keep in touch about our topics here. And thank you very much again, Sarah.
Thanks.
Thank you to the team. Thank you to the audience. Yes, and I wish everyone a nice holidays, even if everyone has to spend these holidays at home. But I'm sure everyone deserves it nevertheless, maybe even more. I'm looking forward to these couple of days as well, even if it's a very difficult time. So everybody, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye and take care. And
Happy Easter.
See you around. Yeah, okay. Happy Easter. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.